All right, are we live on YouTube? You just double check. We should be live on YouTube, but it's been a while actually, so I better double check and make sure before I start prattling on and talking about all the stuff that I need to talk about today. I am indeed. All right, put it out. Hi everybody. So if you've been following this channel and you've been following the progressive news online, I suppose you will maybe have heard about two American freedom fighters who, along with 12 Venezuelans, got caught attempting to overthrow the Venezuelan government and essentially, attempting to overthrow the Venezuelan government, but they got caught by some fishermen in what I've heard described as the Bay of Piglets. Now, this is obviously America, who has been trying to overthrow Venezuela for a while now. And a while ago, a few weeks ago, they put a $15 million bounty on Maduro's head, who is obviously the democratically elected leader of Venezuela. And just recently, I can report, this came out yesterday, that there is a secretive British unit planning for the reconstruction of Venezuela after this Keystone Cops coup attempt apparently was, they thought it was going to be a success, but obviously it wasn't. Now, to talk to me today about this is the guy who wrote this excellent article in the Canary and has done great work on Venezuela. And unlike many journalists over here who talk about Venezuela, has actually been there. It's John McEvoy. Johnny Mac, how are you, man?
Hi, Gordon. How you doing? Very well, thanks.
Oh, good. I'm glad you're doing really well. So we have, it seems, been planning for the quote reconstruction in the UK. Our government have of Venezuela after this coup attempt went down. Tell me all about it, mate. What can you tell me about it?
Yeah, well, I mean, it wasn't specifically after this particular coup attempt. I mean, it could have been after any.
We're certainly backing it, though, aren't we? We're certainly backing this Guaido, who is the CIA stooge, I would say.
You could say that, yeah. I mean, he's certainly backed by the CIA. He's backed by the US State Department. He's backed by Trump. He's backed by Mike Pompeo, who was massively backed by John Bolton before he got the heave-ho. So, yeah, I mean, with regards to this Venezuela reconstruction unit, it kind of appeared in a set of documents that are received via the Freedom of Information Act. And
you sent these Freedom of Information Acts off, did you? You sent these requests off?
Yeah, so I've sent a few different ones off, basically looking to see what the Venezuelan opposition, like how it's discussing its operations with the UK Foreign Office, and what kind of discussions were had. Because Juan Guaido visited London back in January 2020. He met with Boris Johnson, he met with Dominic Raab. So I was after trying to find out what kind of discussions were going on behind the scenes, what he discussed with Dominic Raab. The entire conversation was redacted, unsurprisingly. And what kind of discussions were going on between Juan Guaido's UK representative, Vanessa Neumann, who kind of like is kind of posing a little bit as an ambassador to the UK, except she doesn't have any of the kind of ambassadorial duties or even the ability to issue passports or anything that a normal ambassador would do. So she's kind of wangled a name into the UK representative of Juan Guaido. So I've sent these Freedom of Information requests off to try and figure out what kind of communications are going on behind the scenes. And in doing so, one of the documents I got back reveals this secretive unit that, it had never been revealed by the Foreign Office. It hadn't been spoken about by the head of it, John Saville, who's a long-term UK diplomat going back to, I believe, the 80s, if not the 90s. So you've basically got this unit.
No
as far as I'm aware, there's no relation. No.
Go on, carry on, mate.
Sorry. No, that would be a whole other conversation entirely.
Yes,
So I mean, so what you've got is that you've got this Foreign Office unit dedicated to reconstructing a country, and obviously with the word reconstruction, you have the implicit reference of the destruction, which is implicitly understood to have to happen. Were a coup to take place in Venezuela, it would be just carnage, total carnage. So you've got the existence of this unit, which is news enough. However, in the private correspondence between Neumann and UK officials, you have conversations relating to the sustenance of British business interests in Venezuela in a post-coup country. And now, as most of the listeners will know, Venezuela sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. So you can only start to imagine about what these kind of business interests might be, and that sits within a framework of long-term British intervention on behalf of the likes of BP. I've written a lot about this in terms of Colombia, but in Iran, in Kuwait as well. There's various different chapters of British intervention on behalf of British-based multinational oil companies. And it seems like this is, I mean, this won't be surprising to many people, but it's a different thing to actually have the receipts. So this just seems to sit within a long-standing record of British intervention overseas on behalf of its own interests, but especially oil interests.
But do you say on the behalf of its own interests? Is it on behalf of its own interests, or are we just hanging on to the coattails of America here? Because it's America that are trying to overthrow them in this coup, aren't they?
Yeah, well, there's a few different processes going on at the same time. I mean, one of the main assets that Britain is to the US is that it kind of holds up a shield to the absolute barbarity of US foreign policy in making sure that the US doesn't act unilaterally in foreign countries. I mean, that was one of the key components of forming the coalition against Iraq. It wasn't just to have extra people on the ground; it was to have a coalition that offered legitimacy to the invasion. Like, the more people that are involved, the more legitimate it seems. So that's one way in which the UK kind of supplants US foreign policy. However, at the same time, as these things work, as it worked in Iraq, prior to any destabilization, I wouldn't go as far. We're not in the situation where we're looking at an invasion of Venezuela at the moment. We're in the destabilization phase. We know that conversations go down between the US, between Britain, about how the spoils are going to be divvied up after the destruction within the reconstruction. And so this revelation that came out in the Canary yesterday fits within this context.
Yeah, it does. I seem to remember in the coup of Iran back in 1953, Operation Ajax, when they overthrew Mossadegh to basically rape Iran's oil reserves. They split it up into 5 companies. It was 5 companies that got the right. There was Mexico, I believe, and BP, and there was 5. So it does sound like this is something similar. I mean, I was on the intro. I did, obviously there's some brevity there with the Keystone Cops coup attempt. These 14 people that tried to overthrow this government. I mean, I laugh at it, but this is a bloody serious thing, isn't it? Because
indeed, yeah.
They were trying to kill Maduro. They're trying to basically enact this $15 million bounty that Guaido's put on his head, haven't they?
Yeah, well, I mean, it really harks back to the kind of Wild West of putting a bounty on someone's head. In those days, it'd be Native Americans. There'd been, it's a totally racist endeavor, and so it harks back to that. But just to go more into this Silvercorp USA contract, which was, by all accounts, batshit crazy.
Yeah, let me just show you while you're there, mate. Let me just on the screen. Just so we know, I'm showing the Washington Post article now that actually has the agreement between Silvercorp, which is this company I think that Guaido has hired, hasn't he, to do this. So I'm just showing it on the screen. So we've actually got the paper trail there to say, yeah, Guaido, there's a contract there with this Silvercorp, that's the company of these mercenaries, I suppose. You carry on from there.
Yeah, I mean, Guaido has desperately tried to distance himself from this since it happened, and two of his main advisors have resigned. However, as you say, the paper trail is the burden of proof is quite overwhelming at this point. I mean, Juan Guaido is named as the commander-in-chief on page 39, I believe. There's other documents that bear his signature. Goudreau, the US mercenary, the CEO of Silvercorp USA, who actually planned this entire thing, has gone on to tell two different interviewers that Juan Guaido was central in the planning of this. Another one of the Venezuelan mercenaries who was caught has told the Venezuelan authorities that this plan was actually hatched in Washington while Guaido was visiting to the USA. So I mean, Juan Guaido's hands are all over this. There's absolutely, in my opinion, no way that somebody is the supposed interim president, and I think now he only deserves the name opposition figure.
Yeah.
But let's for the sake of the analogy, this so-called interim president somehow has no idea about this very detailed plan to capture, either kidnap or kill the president, whom he would therefore replace. Is totally crazy to me. And just to add to that, the intricacies of the plan are quite interesting as well, because I've read through the entire document, and one of the things that included was the use of Brazilian and Colombian airspace. Now, I don't know if you've heard that the plan was actually to kidnap Maduro, use a plane from an airport in Caracas, bring him back to the US, and the amount of collaboration that would be necessary to actually carry out a plan of this sort would actually require cross-governmental assistance and collaboration. So the Colombian and the Brazilian governments, I'd be very surprised if they're not involved in this as well, especially considering that the Venezuelan mercenaries and the US mercenaries were actually camped out in Colombia for 6 or so weeks before carrying out the operation. I would be amazed if Colombian intelligence, which has been assisted by US intelligence and actually British intelligence in the past, had no idea that these mercenaries were camped out near the Venezuelan border, ready to, launch this strange incursion. So yeah, I mean, Guaido's hands, by all measures, seem to be all over this plan.
Yeah, it reminds me, it's not the first time I've been talking about democratic states, ganging up. But I mean, this is like say, it's the overthrow of a democratic. Well, I mean, like or loathe Maduro. I'm neither here nor there on him, but I do recognise that the self-identification of people is important, and they've picked Maduro as their leader democratically, and we know this because Jimmy Carter, said that the elections in Venezuela are basically unriggable. And he had a charity, I believe, that basically went around looking at election, whether they were viable or not, and they found that these elections were. That's contrary to what our media have reported, saying that they're rigged. Obviously, I know that you've gone over there. You can verify what I'm saying here is true, can't you, John?
Yeah, well, what I can say is there's never been any hard evidence whatsoever that the elections of 2018, which are the current ones that suddenly became controversial once Maduro looked like he was going to win, were rigged whatsoever. I mean, as you say, Venezuela has a very secure voting process, a very secure electronic voting process. And I mean, you can see if you just look, if you look,
digital thumbprint on it, it's amazing.
Yeah, you can look. I mean, I think there's 7 different steps to it. It's it's really quite something. But just to add, to look to Bolivia at the moment, we've seen the way that the US government and various different US funded associations like the Organization for American States whipped up this narrative that the Bolivian elections in which Morales won were rigged, or they weren't free and fair. And we saw how that occurred in last year. We've seen how it happens, how the narrative of rigged elections is spun. The entire media goes along with it because they suddenly say, Morales won in controversial elections, or in elections that were surrounded by violence and controversy.
Or so you hear the elections that some people allege was
exactly, and and it's always in the passive voice, isn't it? He never says elections that were. Imagine if it was reported like this: elections that were said to be rigged by the U.S. government, which has long had an interest in its natural resources. I mean, that's a way in which you would actually say, you've got the person who's accusing the alleging the rigging of the elections, but you also have the reasoning why they might have a vested interest in doing so. But
So
that's
you've got
never
the balance
actually
there, which is perfect. That's what we need, isn't it? You've got the balance in
Yeah.
that reporting.
Yeah, and a bit of context wouldn't go astray either. The entire history of the post-Second World, the 20th century of the US intervening in Latin America on behalf of democracy, and we've seen how that goes. So the reporting is typically decontextualized. Things are alleged, but they're not alleged by anyone. There's not actually a subject doing the alleging. The alleging just becomes passive, and therefore it becomes common sense. Exactly, some say, and those some are always, more often than not, funded by the US government, which has a vested interest in overthrowing the government. This is just the way the reporting goes, especially in countries like those in Latin America, in which the US and Britain has a vested interest in actually gaining access to their resources.
Yeah, some of us, the more eagle-eyed of us, especially those of us with an Amazon Prime subscription, yes, I've got one of those, could basically see this coming now, because this is pretty much a plot from one of their bloody... Have you seen this Jack Ryan thing that they've done on Amazon? This was...
I got 5 minutes here. I couldn't watch it.
I got 5 minutes into it, but apparently there's some sort of plot that's very similar to this in this Amazon Prime thing. It's almost like they call it Amazon Prime because they're priming people for what the American foreign policy is going to be next. What are we doing here, John? You say that we're going after resources. Is this really going to be some great profitable thing for us if this Venezuelan government is overthrown, or is it, this special relationship again with America that we're, because I tell you what, I watch a lot of American news, as I suspect you do, because you're an actual journalist, a proper journalist, not a pretend journalist like me.
Cheers.
But I watch a lot
You're a
of
proper journalist.
I watch a lot of American news, and they never ever described the relationship between the United Kingdom and the United States as a special one. It's only this side of the Atlantic I hear it. Now, is this just more of a case? Because I get this feeling, John, I don't know about you, about us just hanging on to the American coattails again. And, when does America ever do things for us? Why is it always us doing stuff for them and helping them in their ridiculous coup attempts? Can you shed any light on that for me?
Yeah, well, a lot of it is just trying to maintain as much of Britain's kind of colonial and imperial power that it's slowly been losing since the Second World War. If you look through some of the declassified documents on the kind of 1945 to 1950 period under the Attlee government, you can see Foreign Office officials discussing that, look, we can see that America is becoming this ascending power, and if we want to maintain any of our global hegemony, then we're going to have to hang on to the coattails of this power, and we'll have to form this kind of mutually beneficial relationship in which we offer them our assistance in exchange for their assistance. But obviously, as that power relationship has got more heavily sided with the US, then it becomes more of Britain often hanging on the coattails of what the US is doing and being this kind of junior partner. However, that's not to say that Britain is simply a junior partner. There's many cases in which Britain actually has equal or greater material interests. There's many cases in which Britain is actually. If you look at it in strict power relationships, Britain's basically looking for its share of the pie. In that sense, it's not particularly a special relationship. It's just Britain making sure that it gets as much as it can from a certain context of global relations. But just to add to that, you asked what can Britain get from the situation in Venezuela. Now, one of the main issues of Venezuela, of course, it sits on the largest proven oil reserves in the world. Yeah. But not just that. The Hugo Chavez government was basically a fuck you to a certain global economic system. and as a symbolic representation of resistance to kind of US hegemony, that was just seen as simply unpalatable for the US. In a similar way that Rafael Correa in Ecuador, when the US asked if they could put a military base on the Galapagos Islands, he said, "Yeah, sure, as long as I can put an Ecuadorian military base in Florida." And this just bemused people in the US. They were like, "What's this guy on?" Because this is this kind of mindset that says, we can have military bases all over the world, but that doesn't equate to imperialism. Imperialism is always this thing that ended 30 years prior to the present. So I mean, it's not simply a material gain that the US and Britain would have from Venezuela, although it certainly would be significant. It's also kind of stamping the boot into anyone that tries to resist a global economic system in which the US is at the helm. Finally, another major thing that Venezuela under Chavez and continues to do under Maduro is kind of schemes of regional solidarity. So you had ALBA and you had now I forget the name of the scheme now, but I mean it was one of the schemes was for example offering oil to some of the Caribbean islands such as Haiti,
right,
that had historically been destroyed by imperialism. With loans that had no interest on them whatsoever,
right.
to basically give these countries a chance of recovering from the disaster of what had happened to them in their past.
And a lot of which comes obviously from America's hegemony, especially Haiti and places like that.
Yeah, of
That's
course.
the capitalism, etc.
Yeah, of course. And in this period, of course, the US was involved in getting rid of the Aristide governments in Haiti as well. So I mean, so you've got three kind of strands. You've got one, Venezuela as a sovereign state saying no to the kind of global hegemon. You've got Venezuela as regional solidarity with various countries in Latin America that were forming kind of a different pole to the US led pole. And thirdly, you've also got the direct material interests of it having such a massive oil reserve, and the way in which it's using it was using it for the benefit of the population. Obviously, it's not as easy right now with the sanctions. However, so it's a kind of three-pronged attempt to destroy threat to US global hegemony.
Is that it then for Guaido? Do you think that's it? The writing's on the wall for him now? Do you think they're going to have had enough of him, or do you think they're just going to carry on trying to overthrow this? Because they're looking pretty pathetic right now around the world, aren't they? America.
Yeah, they're certainly looking.
They can't do coups anymore.
Well, I wouldn't put it past them. They just managed one in Bolivia.
Yeah, that's true.
However,
keep failing though in Iran and Venezuela and.
Yeah, well, I mean, in Venezuela, I was speaking to Ali Vargas, a journalist with, various different, he's writing for Mint Press, he was with Telesur before. He's just launched a new English language site from Bolivia that people should check out. Anyway, I was chatting to him earlier this week, and he was basically saying the major difference between Bolivia and Venezuela, the reason why the US managed to initiate the coup successfully in Bolivia, was because the Morales government failed to capture some of the institutions of the state, including the military and the police. And so in the Bolivian coup, what you saw is many military officers who had previously travelled to the US and were trained, in the School of the Americas, etc., etc. They were some of the leading components in the coup. In Venezuela, by contrast, much of the military and much of the internal police force is sympathetic to the government. They come from the same kind of social backgrounds of the people that were actually helped by many years of Chavismo. And so there's a certain loyalty within the military to the sovereignty of the government, which isn't always the same circumstances in different countries in Latin America.
So even if it's not the end of, even if it's the end of Guaido's attempts to be the leader of Venezuela, it's certainly not going to be the end of America's attempts to overthrow it, or our attempts to help them.
Yeah, well, for as long as Chavismo exists and is popular in stopping trying to overthrow it, to be honest. And one of the kind of depressing things about this is the kind of how to put it, the kind of crushing of time of the amount of power that the US has. I mean, it doesn't matter if they overthrow Maduro today or tomorrow. They're so powerful at this point in time that these economic sanctions can just continue and continue and continue. These efforts to capture Maduro can continue and continue and continue for as long as they want. Basically, because there's very little democratic oversight over U.S. foreign policy. I mean, you've got a two-party state there, both parties supporting implicitly or explicitly a coup in Venezuela. You've got an entire media system that bastardizes the government of Venezuela and allows manufacturers consent for overthrowing the government. So you've got very little democratic controls on actually stopping this from happening. Either from the population or from the Congress. So, in a depressing way, I mean, this could go on for a very long time, but the resolve of the Venezuelans, as I noticed when I was there, was very impressive. The resilience was quite amazing.
Yeah, of course, these sanctions and these coup attempts and whatever, it's the people of Venezuela that are suffering the most, isn't it? Thanks very much, John. Is there anything else I need to cover? You've done a great job of this.
That's all good.
Uncovering, us, and our plans. Obviously, should Venezuela and Guaido get his wish.
Yeah, no, thanks to you for having me on.
Thanks very much for your great work, Johnny Mac. Follow him on Twitter at @JMcEvoy_2. Is it?
That's it. Yeah.
I've kept putting him on and obviously subscribe to the Canary as well. They do some great work. Johnny Mac, thanks very much for your time today.